When the Evans family, Laura, her husband David, and their teenage daughter, Emily, learned that they'd inherited an old family home from David's late uncle, they saw it as a chance to start fresh. The house was a grand but crumbling Victorian mansion on the outskirts of a small, forgotten town. The locals eyed them with wary curiosity, whispering warnings about the old Evanston place. Ignoring the warnings, the family moved in, enchanted by the house's charm and mystique. The first night was peaceful, though Laura noticed an unusual coldness that lingered in the hallways, despite the summer heat. As they explored, Emily found a dusty journal tucked away in an upstairs drawer. The cover bore the name Alice Evanston, a relative they had never heard of. That night, as they settled in, the house creaked and groaned as if it were alive, breathing softly around them. A few days later, while cleaning, Laura uncovered a portrait hidden behind an old, dusty curtain in the sitting room. It was a painting of a young woman with sad eyes, her gaze distant and haunting. David guessed it must be Alice Evanston, the mysterious relative from the journal. Emily, feeling drawn to the portrait, insisted on keeping it on display despite Laura's objections. That night, Emily thought she saw the eyes in the painting follow her as she moved across the room. She dismissed it as a trick of the light, but a lingering unease settled in her mind. Curious, she started reading Alice's journal, discovering entries filled with strange musings about dark visitors and whispers from the walls. She mentioned a cold room that seemed to draw her in, a place where no one else was allowed to go. Emily couldn't shake the feeling that the house was hiding secrets that might still be alive. As they continued exploring, they found a locked door at the end of the upstairs hallway. When David forced it open, a rush of icy air seeped out, and they discovered a small windowless room filled with dust and broken furniture. The walls were covered in old, faded wallpaper, and the smell of decay was overpowering. Emily immediately recognized it as the cold room mentioned in Alice's journal. Laura felt an intense dread standing in that room, as though 1,000 eyes were watching her. David dismissed it as just an old, unused storage space, but that night, strange noises echoed from the room, soft scratching, like nails scraping against the walls. Emily swore she heard whispers in the darkness, voices too faint to understand. The family agreed to keep the door locked, but each of them could feel the room's presence, seeping through the walls and down the hall, invading their dreams. One night, Laura awoke to the feeling of someone standing at the foot of her bed. She opened her eyes and gasped, seeing the faint outline of a figure, barely visible in the darkness. When she blinked, the figure was gone, leaving her wondering if she'd been dreaming. The next morning she found small, wet footprints leading from the cold room to her bedroom door. David insisted it must have been Emily, but Emily denied it, looking just as terrified. Laura began to worry about her family's safety, but David, always the skeptic, refused to leave, dismissing the events as coincidence. However, every night the footprints reappeared, leading from the cold room to different parts of the house. And every night, Laura felt the eerie sensation of being watched, the figure's presence growing stronger and closer. As the days passed, Emily grew obsessed with learning more about Alice, sensing a connection with the young woman in the portrait. One afternoon, she discovered a stack of letters hidden behind a loose floorboard in her bedroom. The letters, written in elegant, old-fashioned handwriting, revealed Alice's growing fear of something she referred to as the shadow. According to the letters, Alice believed that the shadow was connected to the family's past sins, bound to haunt them forever. The more Emily read, the more she felt like Alice was speaking directly to her, warning her about something waiting in the house. Emily showed the letters to Laura, who began to question what really happened in the house all those years ago. David, however, grew angry, accusing them of letting their imaginations run wild, refusing to believe his family could be haunted by some dark legacy. While cleaning one evening, Laura noticed something unusual in the hallway mirror, a shadowy figure standing just behind her reflection, watching her with hollow eyes. She spun around, but there was nothing there. But in the mirror, the figure remained, its mouth slowly twisting into a smile. Laura screamed, and when David and Emily came running, the figure vanished. Laura was now certain the house was haunted, but David continued to dismiss her fears, refusing to believe in what he couldn't see. That night, Emily noticed the same shadowy figure in her own reflection, standing behind her in the bathroom mirror, whispering her name in a voice that sounded strangely familiar. The house seemed to be drawing them in, trapping them in its twisted, dark reflection, and the family began to feel like they were no longer alone. As Emily continued reading Alice's journal, she came across a final frantic entry where Alice warned about the coming night. According to Alice, once the spirit of the shadow was awakened, it would haunt the family until every one of them was drawn into its darkness. Emily tried to tell her parents, but David brushed her off, claiming it was just the ramblings of a disturbed mind. However, Laura listened intently, feeling an icy dread settle over her. That night, Emily heard whispers calling her name, beckoning her to the cold room. She resisted, but the urge grew stronger, pulling her down the dark hallway. When she reached the door, she felt a hand on her shoulder and turned to see Alice's faint figure in the shadows, her face twisted with fear. Alice mouthed a single word, "Run." The family's fear reached a breaking point when David finally encountered the shadow himself. Late one night, he found himself unable to move, a suffocating darkness pressing down on his chest. The shadowy figure stood over him, its eyes hollow and accusing, like it had been waiting for him. David tried to scream, but no sound escaped his mouth. The shadow leaned closer, whispering his name in a voice that felt both familiar and alien. When it finally released him, David stumbled out of bed, his face pale and drenched in sweat. Now a believer, he agreed with Laura and Emily that they needed to leave, but as they packed, they found the front door jammed shut and every window locked from the inside. The house seemed to be alive, determined to keep them within its walls. Desperate, Emily remembered one final entry in Alice's journal, a description of a ritual to banish the shadow. According to Alice, the shadow was tied to a terrible sin committed by the family, a betrayal that cursed the bloodline. To end the haunting, they needed to confront the shadow in the cold room and offer a piece of themselves. They gathered in the cold room, clutching hands as they recited Alice's incantation, their voices trembling. The air grew colder, the shadow swirling around them, its voice echoing with the pain and hatred of generations past. Suddenly, Alice's ghostly figure appeared beside them, mouthing the final words of the incantation. The shadow let out a piercing scream before dissipating, leaving the room silent and still. With the shadow seemingly gone, the family left the house as soon as dawn broke. They never spoke of the events again, and David sold the house to a distant buyer, hoping to bury the nightmare. But as they drove away, Emily glanced back, catching a glimpse of the house in the rearview mirror. In the upstairs window, she saw Alice's figure, watching them with a sad smile, her hand raised in a silent wave. And just behind her, another shadowy figure appeared, watching with hollow, patient eyes. The family never returned, but rumors about the Evanston house persisted, and years later, new tenants would find Alice's journal waiting for them in the same dusty drawer.